It's 1943, and a German naval officer stands on the deck of an American aircraft carrier. Not by choice, he's a prisoner of war. But as he looks around, his training, his doctrine, everything he thought he knew about naval warfare, it all collapses. The flight deck stretches before him like a highway. Aircraft hang from the ceiling of hangar bays the size of cathedrals. Thousands of sailors move with choreographed precision. And somewhere in his mind, a terrifying realization forms. We never stood a chance. This is the story of how German officers, the best-trained naval minds in Europe, came face to face with a weapon they had completely misunderstood. A weapon that would rewrite the rules of war at sea. A weapon that proved Germany had been preparing for the wrong war entirely. Our story begins not with grand strategy or high-level intelligence, but with whispers from the Atlantic. Confused reports, impossible sightings, stories that seemed too absurd to believe. In the early months of World War II, the German Kriegsmarine, the Navy, operated under doctrines that had been refined over decades. Battleships were the queens of the sea. Cruisers provided the muscle. And U-boats? U-boats were the silent killers that would strangle Britain's supply lines and bring the island nation to its knees. Aircraft carriers existed, sure. The British had a few. But to German eyes, they were curiosities, fragile vessels that needed heavy protection. Useful for scouting maybe, or providing some light air cover, but hardly the backbone of a modern navy. That assumption was about to be shattered. The first hints came from U-boat commanders returning from patrols in the Atlantic. These were experienced men, seasoned submariners who had hunted convoys across thousands of miles of ocean, and they were reporting things that didn't make sense. One captain described spotting a silhouette on the horizon that his crew initially mistook for an island. When they looked through the periscope again, the island had moved. Another spoke of a vessel so large it seemed to combine the mass of a battleship with the length of... What? There was no comparison in their experience. These weren't just big ships, they were impossibly big. Back in Berlin, naval intelligence received these reports with skepticism. Intercepted signals mentioned American carriers, but the numbers seemed inflated. Propaganda, perhaps. Allied disinformation designed to intimidate. They had photographs, yes, but paper and grainy images couldn't convey the visceral reality of these vessels. But here's the thing. The evidence kept piling up. U-boat commanders told of a fundamental shift in Atlantic convoy warfare. Convoys that had once been vulnerable, traveling through gaps in air coverage where submarines could strike with relative impunity, now had constant aerial protection. Not from distant land bases hundreds of miles away, but from ships. From platforms that traveled with the convoys. For submarines, this changed everything. The hunter had become the hunted. A U-boat's greatest weapon was stealth. It could lurk beneath the waves, line up its torpedo shot, strike, and disappear. But aircraft changed the equation. Planes could spot the telltale wake of a periscope. They could track oil slicks. They could force submarines to dive and remain submerged, burning through precious battery power and oxygen. And these planes weren't coming from Britain. They were coming from ships that seemed to be everywhere at once. German officers studying these reports faced a troubling realization. Convoys now sailed under a permanent aerial shield. The gap, that crucial window where U-boats had operated freely, was closing. And it was closing because America had brought the airfield to the ocean. As 1942 progressed, German intelligence began receiving detailed reports from an unexpected source, their Japanese allies. The Pacific Theater was thousands of miles away, but what happened there would send shockwaves through Berlin's naval command. Because if the Atlantic reports had been concerning, the Pacific reports were absolutely terrifying. June 1942, the Battle of Midway. German officers read the dispatches with mounting disbelief. 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed in a single engagement. These weren't small vessels. These were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, and they had been annihilated by American carrier aircraft. What shocked German analysts wasn't just the outcome, but the method. This wasn't a traditional naval battle with ships pounding each other with heavy guns at close range. The opposing fleets never saw each other. The entire battle was fought by aircraft, with carriers launching strike after strike across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. For German officers trained in the Jutland tradition, where battleships closed to gunnery range and slugged it out, this was like watching a completely different sport. The rules had changed, and nobody had told them. But the Pacific reports revealed something even more disturbing: the sheer operational range of American carrier warfare. Think about European geography for a moment. Britain is an island. France, Norway, the Mediterranean, everything is relatively close together. Air cover from land bases could reach most operational areas. Naval engagements happened within a few hundred miles of friendly coasts. The Pacific was nothing like that. The distances involved were staggering. American carriers were operating across thousands of miles of open ocean, projecting power across an area larger than all of Europe. They weren't just supporting operations, they were the operation, self-contained, mobile, capable of sustaining combat for weeks without touching land. To German minds accustomed to the geographic constraints of European warfare, this seemed almost impossible. Yet the Americans had made it reality. And they were doing it again and again. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Gilbert Islands. Each operation featured carriers providing air cover, striking shore installations, protecting amphibious landings. The Japanese, for all their skill and ferocity, were being systematically pushed back by an enemy that could bring overwhelming air power to any point in the Pacific. German naval officers followed these developments closely. They understood what they were witnessing: a revolution in naval warfare. The age of the battleship, the age they had trained for, was ending. And they were on the wrong side of history. But intelligence reports and battle accounts, no matter how detailed, couldn't fully prepare German officers for their first direct encounter with an American carrier. That moment came for many when they were captured and transported aboard these vessels. Imagine spending your entire naval career in the cramped confines of a U-boat or the utilitarian quarters of a German cruiser. Then imagine stepping onto the deck of an Essex-class carrier. The first thing that hits you is the scale. The flight deck alone stretches nearly 900 feet, almost 3 football fields. It's not just long. It's wide enough that aircraft can be arranged in rows, dozens of them, lined up like cars in a massive parking lot. You could walk from bow to stern and feel like you're crossing a small town. One captured German officer in a post-war memoir described his first view of a carrier's hangar deck. He wrote, "I thought I had stepped into a factory, not a ship. The ceiling was so high, the space so vast, that I forgot momentarily I was at sea. The hangar bays were the size of warehouses. Aircraft hung from rails in the ceiling, efficiently stored to maximize space. Crews moved between them with practiced ease, performing maintenance, loading weapons, preparing planes for launch. Everything was organized with industrial precision. But it wasn't just the physical size that shocked German officers. It was what that size represented. See, German warships were built around a philosophy of concentrated firepower and heavy armor. The Bismarck, the Tirpitz. These were steel fortresses designed to absorb punishment and dish it out with massive guns. Every ton of displacement was devoted to making them harder to kill and more lethal in surface combat. American carriers represented the opposite philosophy. They sacrificed gun turrets and thick armor in favor of aviation infrastructure. The ship itself became a platform, a delivery system for the real weapons, the aircraft. To German officers raised on battleship doctrine, this initially seemed reckless. Why would you build a massive warship and then strip it of its primary weapons? Where were the 15-inch guns? Where was the Citadel armor? But here's what they gradually understood. The aircraft were the weapons. And they were far more versatile and far-reaching than any cannon could ever be. A single carrier could launch reconnaissance planes to scout hundreds of miles in every direction, dive bombers to strike enemy ships with precision, torpedo bombers to deliver killing blows below the waterline, fighters to defend the fleet against air attack. All from one platform, all capable of striking targets that would be completely beyond the range of traditional naval guns. The ship itself became something new, a mobile fortress of aviation. But if the scale of carriers shocked German officers, the daily life aboard them was something else entirely. Because these weren't just warships, they were communities. Functioning cities at sea. Let's talk about the numbers for a moment. An Essex-class carrier had a crew of approximately 3,500 men. For comparison, the Bismarck, Germany's largest battleship, carried about 2,200. And the Bismarck was already considered enormous by German standards. But it wasn't just about having more people. It was about how those people lived. German U-boats were floating torture chambers of claustrophobia. Crews lived in conditions that would violate every modern standard of habitability. Bunks were squeezed between pipes and machinery. The air was thick with diesel fumes, body odor, and recycled breath. Privacy didn't exist. Proper hygiene was nearly impossible. Men lived for weeks in these steel coffins, enduring conditions that would break most people. Even German surface ships, while more spacious, were Spartan. Narrow corridors, small mess halls, tight cabins. Everything was functional, nothing was comfortable. The philosophy was, this is war. Luxury is weakness. Suffer and be strong. American carriers operated under a completely different philosophy. German prisoners of war who were transported aboard carriers couldn't believe what they saw. There were mess halls, multiple mess halls, where hundreds of sailors could eat at once. The galleys served hot meals with actual variety, fresh vegetables, eggs, coffee, and yes, ice cream, on a warship, in the middle of the ocean. German sailors subsisted on hard bread, canned meat, and thin soup. Their rations were calculated to the minimum required for survival. Meanwhile, American sailors were eating meals that German officers would have considered luxurious even in peacetime. One captured German officer, questioned about his experience aboard a carrier, said simply, "It was demoralizing. How could we maintain morale when our men lived like rats while their sailors lived like this?" But food was just the beginning. Carriers had medical facilities that resembled small hospitals, surgical bays, wards for the wounded, trained doctors and corpsmen ready to handle not just battle casualties but also the routine illnesses that could sweep through a crew of thousands. German ships had a doctor if they were lucky, improvising with whatever supplies they had. There were barber shops, gyms, recreation areas, even movie projectors that screened films for entertainment during long deployments. To German officers, these seemed like absurd luxuries, frivolous, wasteful. Why would you dedicate precious space and resources to comfort? But here's what the Americans understood, and what the Germans had missed. Long-term combat effectiveness isn't just about weapons and armor. It's about the human beings operating those systems. A crew that's well-fed, well-rested, and maintained with some basic comforts can sustain operations far longer than a crew living in constant misery. Morale isn't a soft concept. It's a combat multiplier. It affects everything from decision-making to reaction time to the willingness to push through exhaustion. The Americans had engineered human endurance into the very design of their ships. But perhaps nothing impressed German observers more than watching carrier flight operations in action. Because this was where all the pieces came together. The scale, the infrastructure, the training, the coordination. Launch operations were like watching a perfectly choreographed industrial ballet. The flight deck of a carrier in operation is controlled chaos that only looks like chaos if you don't understand the system. Hundreds of men move in color-coded shirts, each color indicating a specific role. Yellow shirts direct aircraft, red shirts handle weapons and ordnance. Purple shirts fuel the planes. Blue shirts move and position aircraft. Green shirts operate catapults and arresting gear. From above, it looks like a swarm of colored ants working with impossible coordination. German officers watching this, either from intelligence footage or firsthand as prisoners, were astounded by the efficiency. Planes were brought up from the hangar on massive elevators. They were positioned, fueled, armed, and launched in a continuous flow. The carrier could launch dozens of aircraft in minutes, then recover them just as quickly when they returned. This wasn't just impressive. It was a fundamental shift in how naval power worked. Traditional warships were relatively simple in their combat operations. A battleship pointed its guns, calculated range and bearing, and fired. Even with all the complexity of fire control systems, the basic operation was straightforward. A carrier, by contrast, was orchestrating hundreds of simultaneous operations. Aircraft maintenance, weapons loading, fuel management, flight scheduling, launch and recovery operations, radar coordination, fighter direction. All happening at once, all requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. One mistake, one plane in the wrong position, one fuel line not disconnected, one arresting wire that failed, could kill dozens of men and turn the flight deck into an inferno. Yet, American carriers performed these operations repeatedly, under combat conditions, in bad weather, at night. And they made it look routine. German accounts of carrier operations often use the same word, unmenschlich, inhuman. Not as an insult, but as an observation. The level of coordination seemed beyond human capability. It was as if the crew and the ship had merged into a single organism, operating with mechanical efficiency. But here's what really disturbed German officers. This wasn't some elite demonstration team performing under perfect conditions. This was standard operation. Every American carrier could do this. Every crew was trained to this level. The Americans had systematized excellence. Now we need to talk about something that haunted German naval planners more than anything else: American industrial capacity. Because even if you understood carrier tactics, even if you grasped their strategic value, there was still one overwhelming reality that crushed any hope of countering them. America could build them faster than Germany could sink them. Let's put some numbers into perspective. When Germany laid the keel for a major warship like the Bismarck, it was a national endeavor. Years of planning, massive resource allocation, political maneuvering within the Reich to secure priority for materials and labor. The Bismarck took nearly 3 years to build, from keel laying to commissioning. And when it was finally complete, it represented an enormous portion of Germany's naval capacity, irreplaceable, invaluable, a ship the Kriegsmarine could not afford to lose. The Americans built Essex-class carriers in 18 months. Not one, 24 of them. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards launched these massive vessels at a pace that German intelligence initially refused to believe. The reports had to be wrong, they thought. Propaganda. Inflated numbers designed to intimidate. But they weren't wrong. Here's how it worked. American shipyards didn't build carriers one at a time, waiting for each to complete before starting the next. They worked in parallel, multiple keels laid simultaneously. Standardized components manufactured across different facilities, then shipped to assembly points. Modular construction techniques that treated the carrier almost like a massive industrial product rather than a unique creation. It was shipbuilding on an industrial scale that Europe had never seen. For German officers, reading these intelligence reports was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. They understood the implications immediately. Even if the Kriegsmarine managed to sink a carrier, which would require enormous luck and sacrifice, another one was already months away from completion, probably 2 more, maybe 3. The arithmetic was brutal and undeniable. Germany couldn't build carriers fast enough to compete. They lacked the shipyard capacity, the industrial infrastructure, the raw materials, and the technical expertise. They had started the war with no carriers at all, and their attempts to convert merchant ships or build them from scratch had been disasters, projects that consumed resources while producing nothing combat effective. Meanwhile, America was churning out finished carriers like automobiles. But it wasn't just carriers. It was everything. The aircraft that flew from them, the fuel that powered them, the ammunition, the spare parts, the supplies. Every carrier that left an American port was backed by an industrial machine that seemed to have no limits. German war production was a fragmented mess. Competing agencies fought for Hitler's favor. Resources were chronically scarce. Allied bombing campaigns disrupted supply chains. Labor shortages plagued every sector. Just maintaining the existing fleet was a struggle, let alone expanding it. American factories, by contrast, operated at scales that seemed impossible. They produced tens of thousands of aircraft per year, millions of tons of shipping, all while the American civilian economy continued to function, with consumer goods still available and rationing far less severe than in Europe. To German officers, this was perhaps the most demoralizing reality of all. They were fighting an enemy that could wage total war without exhausting itself. An enemy that could sustain losses and simply build replacements. An enemy whose industrial capacity seemed almost limitless. One captured German admiral during post-war interrogation was asked about carrier warfare. His response was blunt. Tactics were irrelevant. We were fighting arithmetic. And in arithmetic, America had already won. But let's zoom in on what made carriers truly revolutionary, the aircraft themselves. Because German officers understood firepower. They understood what a 15-inch gun could do to an enemy ship. They understood torpedo spreads and armor penetration and all the mathematics of traditional naval combat. What they didn't fully grasp, not until it was too late, was how aircraft fundamentally transformed the range and nature of naval warfare. Think about a traditional surface engagement. Two fleets spot each other, maybe 20 miles apart. They close to gun range, let's say 10 to 15 miles for effective fire. They pound away at each other until one side breaks off or sinks. The entire battle takes place within a relatively small geographic area, defined by how far ships can see and how far guns can shoot. Now consider carrier warfare. A carrier's strike aircraft could reach out 200 miles or more. That's not miles of effective fire. That's miles to the target, strike it, and return. The carrier could hit enemy ships that didn't even know it was there. Ships that had no way to fight back because they were beyond the horizon, completely out of range. This redefined what engagement range meant. German battleships with their massive guns were designed to dominate at 20,000 to 30,000 yards, roughly 10 to 15 miles. Impressive by traditional standards. But a carrier-based dive bomber could travel more than 10 times that distance, drop its payload, and be gone before the target could even mount a defense. The parallels were devastating. Imagine being a German naval captain, standing on the bridge of a heavy cruiser, watching your radar screens. Nothing in sight. Seas empty. You're confident, ready. Your guns are trained and loaded. Then aircraft appear. Dozens of them. They're not from any land base. You're too far from shore. They're from a carrier you can't see, can't reach, can't fight. The planes scatter your escorts with fighters. Dive bombers scream down, bombs whistling. Torpedo bombers come in low and fast. Your anti-aircraft guns fire desperately, but there are too many. And even if you survive this wave, another will come, and another. Your guns, those beautiful, expensive, powerful guns, are useless. You can't shoot what you can't reach. This scenario wasn't theoretical. It played out again and again in the Pacific. Japanese battleships, some of the finest ever built, were sent to the bottom by waves of carrier aircraft. Ships that could have dominated any surface engagement never got the chance because they never got close enough to use their guns. German officers studying these engagements saw their own future. The Bismarck, the Tirpitz, all those expensive battleships they had pinned their hopes on, were suddenly obsolete. Not because they weren't formidable, but because the rules of naval warfare had changed. And it wasn't just about sinking ships. Carriers provided capabilities that fundamentally altered how naval campaigns were fought. Reconnaissance. A carrier could launch scout planes to search hundreds of square miles of ocean. Finding the enemy fleet was no longer a matter of luck or guesswork. It was systematic, comprehensive, nearly impossible to avoid. Air superiority. Carrier fighters could establish control over a region of ocean, denying enemy aircraft the ability to operate. Suddenly, an entire fleet could move under an umbrella of protection. Strike capability. Multiple carriers operating together could launch coordinated strikes with hundreds of aircraft. The concentrated firepower was equivalent to an entire air force appearing from nowhere, striking and disappearing again. Flexibility. Unlike land-based aircraft tied to fixed airfields, carriers could move. They could reposition based on intelligence, weather, or strategic need. The battlefield itself became mobile. For German naval doctrine, built around rigid operational plans and carefully calculated engagements, this flexibility was maddening. How do you plan a battle when the enemy's airfields can move? How do you avoid combat when the enemy's reach extends in all directions? One telling detail comes from post-war German analyses. Naval staff officers calculated that a single Essex-class carrier, properly deployed, had roughly the same strike capacity as 80 to 100 land-based aircraft. But the land-based planes were tied to airfields that could be bombed, blockaded, or simply outmaneuvered. The carrier carried its airfield with it. And remember, America wasn't building one carrier. It was building dozens. Each one represented a mobile airfield with strike capacity equivalent to a medium-sized air force. The mathematics were overwhelming. German officers understood immediately that no combination of battleships, cruisers, or U-boats could counter this. The game had changed, and Germany was playing by old rules. Now let's talk about a theater where German officers saw American carrier power firsthand: the Mediterranean. Before Allied carriers arrived in force, the Mediterranean was a contested zone. The German Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force operated from bases in Sicily, Sardinia, southern Italy, and North Africa. Axis forces controlled significant stretches of coastline. Convoys had to be carefully planned and heavily defended. Then came Operation Torch in November 1942, the Allied invasion of North Africa. German commanders watching from Tunisia and Libya saw something that fundamentally altered their understanding of amphibious warfare. Because the Allied invasion wasn't just protected by carriers, it was enabled by carriers. Here's what happened. Allied carrier groups positioned themselves off the North African coast and established a protective dome of air coverage. Fighters patrolled constantly, preventing Axis aircraft from reaching the invasion beaches. Strike aircraft pounded coastal defenses, disrupting German and Italian responses before they could organize effective counterattacks. The invasion forces landed under this aerial umbrella, nearly unmolested. For German officers trained in defensive doctrine, this was deeply disturbing. They had always assumed that amphibious landings were vulnerable operations. Troops packed in landing craft, exposed on beaches, requiring time to organize and push inland. The defensive advantage was supposed to belong to the side with prepared positions and air support from nearby bases. But the carriers had inverted that equation. Suddenly, the invading force had its own air support, constant and overwhelming, while the defenders struggled to get planes into the air. German field commanders sent increasingly desperate requests to their superiors. Where is our air cover? Why can't the Luftwaffe respond? The answer was brutal. Luftwaffe aircraft were flying from bases in Sicily and Sardinia, hundreds of miles away. They had to fight through Allied fighters just to reach the combat zone, and by the time they arrived, they were low on fuel, outnumbered, and facing fresh enemy fighters that had just launched from carriers sitting 50 miles offshore. The tempo was unsustainable. Luftwaffe squadrons could mount sorties a few times per day. The carriers launched aircraft continuously, rotating strikes so there was never a gap in coverage. One captured German document from the Tunisia campaign, now in Allied archives, contains a revealing note. Enemy air superiority is absolute. Our forces cannot move in daylight without immediate attack. Reinforcement by sea is impossible. This is not combat. This is execution. Then came Sicily in July 1943, and the lesson was driven home even harder. The invasion of Sicily was the largest amphibious operation to date in the war, and American carriers played a central role. They didn't just defend the fleet, they systematically dismantled Axis defensive capabilities before the invasion even began. In the days leading up to the landing, carrier aircraft struck airfields across Sicily and southern Italy. They caught German and Italian planes on the ground, cratered runways, destroyed fuel dumps, and generally ensured that Axis air power was crippled before it could respond to the invasion. When the landings began, those same carriers provided close air support, pounding German defensive positions with a precision and intensity that land-based bombers couldn't match. Because the carriers were right there, just offshore, able to respond to requests for support within minutes. German commanders on the ground described it as fighting blind under a hammer. They couldn't see where attacks would come from. They couldn't move reinforcements without being spotted and struck. Every concentration of forces drew immediate air attack. Every defensive position was vulnerable, and there was nothing they could do about it. You can't shoot down a carrier with artillery. You can't torpedo it from shore. You can't even find it sometimes. Carrier groups maneuvered constantly, shifting position to avoid submarines or land-based airstrikes. For the Germans, the Mediterranean campaigns proved that geography was no longer a defensive asset. Narrow seas, fortified coasts, concentrated air forces, none of it mattered when the enemy could bring its own mobile airfields and establish local air superiority wherever it chose to invade. The carriers had turned the Mediterranean from a contested sea into an allied lake. But if the Mediterranean was troubling, the Pacific was absolutely haunting. Because in the Pacific, German officers, through intelligence reports and liaison with their Japanese allies, saw the full, terrifying scope of what American carrier warfare could achieve. Let's start with Midway again, but dig deeper into what that battle meant. June 4, 1942. 4 of Japan's finest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were destroyed in a single day. Ships that had been considered the cutting edge of naval power, gone in hours. But here's what German analysts noticed. The American victory at Midway wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about a completely new form of naval intelligence and combat coordination. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. They knew where the Japanese fleet would be. But knowing where your enemy is doesn't matter if you can't reach them with enough force to make a difference. This is where carriers proved their value. American carriers maneuvered into position, launched massive strikes, and caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with planes on deck being refueled and rearmed. The entire battle was decided by air power. The opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. No big guns fired in anger. It was a clash of aircraft, a test of aviation doctrine, logistics, training, and industrial capacity. And America had won decisively. German officers studying the battle came away with several chilling conclusions. First, carrier battles were decisive in a way that surface battles had never been. When battleships fought, even the losing side usually survived to fight again. Damaged ships limped home, were repaired, returned to service. But when carriers fought, the loser was often utterly destroyed. 4 Japanese carriers sank at Midway. Those ships, and more importantly, their trained crews and air wings, were gone forever. Second, the Americans had demonstrated an ability to coordinate multiple carrier groups across vast distances. This wasn't just one carrier. It was a carrier task force, with multiple carriers, escorts, supply ships, all working in concert. The complexity was staggering, yet the Americans made it look routine. But Midway was just the beginning. As the war in the Pacific progressed, German intelligence officers tracking the conflict saw an operational tempo that seemed impossible to sustain. Yet the Americans sustained it anyway. The island-hopping campaign revealed the true strategic power of carriers. Here's how it worked. American forces would identify a Japanese-held island. Instead of trying to invade it directly against prepared defenses, they would first establish carrier dominance. Multiple carrier groups would arrive, their aircraft suppressing Japanese air power, pounding shore installations, isolating the garrison from reinforcement. Only then would the amphibious assault begin, with the carriers providing constant close air support throughout the operation. And here's the key detail that German officers found most disturbing. The Americans didn't need to build airfields before they could operate. The carriers were the airfields. Traditional doctrine said you needed to capture an island, build an airfield, bring in planes, establish air superiority, then move on to the next objective. The process was slow, methodical, vulnerable. American carriers compressed that timeline to days or even hours. They arrived with air superiority built into their hulls. They could support operations immediately without waiting for engineers to level ground and pour concrete. This changed the fundamental rhythm of warfare. The Japanese defenders couldn't prepare, couldn't build up defenses, couldn't wait for reinforcements, because the Americans weren't waiting for anything. They arrived in force, established dominance, and moved to the next target before Japan could respond. By 1944, German observers were tracking battles like the Philippine Sea, where the sheer scale of American carrier operations reached overwhelming proportions. In what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carrier aircraft shot down hundreds of Japanese planes while suffering minimal losses themselves. The Americans had achieved something that seemed almost impossible: complete carrier aviation dominance. Their pilots were better trained, their planes were better maintained, their tactics were superior, and they had more of everything: more planes, more carriers, more fuel, more ammunition. One German naval analyst, in a report sent to Berlin in late 1944, wrote something remarkable. If the Americans were to shift even a fraction of their Pacific carrier strength to the Atlantic, the war at sea would end within weeks. We have no defense against such power. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't defeatist propaganda or low morale. This was a sober, professional assessment from experienced officers who understood naval warfare. And their conclusion was that carrier power had become so dominant that traditional naval forces were essentially irrelevant. But there's one aspect of American carrier operations that we haven't fully addressed yet, and it's arguably the most important: logistics. Because all the impressive technology, all the tactical innovations, all the strategic brilliance, none of it matters if you can't sustain operations. And this is where the Americans achieved something that German officers found almost incomprehensible. They made carrier operations sustainable over months, even years, at enormous distances from home ports. Let's talk numbers again. An Essex-class carrier required approximately 6,500 tons of aviation fuel to sustain full operations for a month. It needed hundreds of tons of ordnance, bombs, torpedoes, ammunition for aircraft guns. It required spare parts for dozens of aircraft, food for 3,500 men, medical supplies, fresh water, lubricants, replacement aircraft, replacement crew members. And it needed all of this while operating thousands of miles from the nearest American port. The solution was the fleet train, a support network of tankers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, supply ships, and hospital ships that followed the carriers, enabling them to remain at sea for extended periods. German officers had never seen anything like it. The Kriegsmarine operated close to European ports out of necessity. German ships ventured out, fought, and returned home to replenish. The idea of sustaining a fleet in continuous combat operations across an entire ocean was beyond their experience, but the Americans had created a mobile logistics base. Underway replenishment became an art form, tankers pulling alongside carriers while both ships were in motion, transferring fuel through hoses while maintaining formation. Supply ships delivered ammunition and stores in the same way, a dangerous dance of steel hulls and loading booms that was performed routinely in all weather, sometimes under combat conditions. This meant that American carriers didn't have to retreat to Pearl Harbor or San Diego after every operation. They could resupply at sea, repair minor damage with their own workshops or with support from dedicated repair ships, and stay in the fight. The implications were strategic. In the Pacific, American carriers maintained an almost continuous presence. Just as one carrier group withdrew for major maintenance, another arrived to take its place. The pressure on Japanese defenses never let up. German defenders never experienced that kind of sustained pressure. Allied operations in Europe had pauses, windows where German forces could regroup and prepare. But in the Pacific, the carriers enabled a tempo of operations that gave the Japanese no breathing room. And it wasn't just about fuel and ammunition. The Americans had thought through every aspect of sustained carrier operations. Medical facilities aboard carriers were extensive, but for serious cases, hospital ships provided floating trauma centers with full surgical capabilities. Wounded sailors and pilots could receive treatment without the carrier having to break off operations. Aircraft that were damaged but repairable were fixed aboard the carrier if possible, or transferred to specialized tender ships equipped with workshops. Replacement aircraft were delivered by escort carriers that served as ferries, transporting planes from factories in America to the combat zone. Even pilot replacement was systematized. When experienced pilots completed their tours, new pilots arrived to replace them, maintaining the overall skill level of air wings. The Americans had created a conveyor belt of trained personnel that kept their carriers at peak effectiveness. For German officers analyzing this system, the conclusion was inescapable. America wasn't just building carriers and aircraft. It was building an entire ecosystem of support that enabled those carriers to operate at maximum efficiency for as long as necessary. This was war waged as an industrial process, optimized and sustained on a scale that Germany could never match. We've talked a lot about ships and systems, but we need to talk about the people operating them. Because one of the things that shocked German officers most was the way American carrier crews functioned. Remember, German military tradition emphasized rigid hierarchy, strict discipline, and absolute obedience. This wasn't unique to Germany. Most European militaries operated similarly. Officers made decisions, enlisted men followed orders. The system worked, but it was inflexible. American carriers operated differently. Not without discipline, they had plenty of that, but with a different philosophy about how to organize thousands of people in a complex, dangerous environment. Flight deck operations are the perfect example. During launch and recovery operations, the flight deck of a carrier is one of the most dangerous work environments imaginable. Aircraft engines running at full power, propellers spinning, jet exhausts blasting heat and fumes, planes maneuvering in tight spaces, ordnance being loaded, fuel lines being connected, arresting gear under enormous tension. One mistake kills people. One moment of inattention and someone gets blown overboard or shredded by a propeller. The margin for error is zero. Yet American carrier crews performed these operations with remarkable efficiency, and they did it by training sailors at every level to take initiative within their area of responsibility. The color-coded shirt system is illustrative. Each crew member on the flight deck wore a shirt indicating their role. They were trained extensively for that specific job, and when operations began, they executed without waiting for constant direction from officers. Yellow shirts, the aircraft directors, made split-second decisions about where planes should be positioned. Purple shirts, the fuel crews, managed dangerous fueling operations with minimal supervision. Green shirts, the catapult and arresting gear operators, coordinated launches and recoveries with perfect timing. Officers supervised overall operations, but the actual execution was distributed across the crew. Each person was trusted to do their job correctly, to speak up if they saw a problem, to take initiative when necessary. To German officers observing this system, it seemed chaotic at first. Where were the constant orders? Where was the micromanagement? But then they realized the chaos was organized. Every person knew their role, had been trained to excellence, and was empowered to act. This created a resilience that German systems lacked. If an officer was killed or incapacitated, American operations continued because the enlisted personnel could step up. The system didn't collapse when any single point failed. Another aspect that impressed German observers was the investment in training. American pilots underwent extensive instruction before ever seeing combat. They flew hundreds of hours in training. They practiced carrier landings until it became instinctive. They learned tactics, navigation, aircraft recognition, everything they needed to be effective. And when they entered combat, they weren't expected to figure things out on their own. They had radios, could communicate with the carrier, received direction from fighter directors who coordinated the entire air group. Compare that to German practice, where resource shortages often meant cutting training short, sending pilots into combat with minimal preparation, and hoping experience would teach them what they needed to know. The results spoke for themselves. American pilots were, on average, more effective because they were more thoroughly prepared. But perhaps most telling was the way American carriers treated their crews as valuable assets worth preserving. German military culture often glorified sacrifice. Death in combat was honorable, comfort was weakness, survival was secondary to duty. American carriers operated under a different philosophy. A living, well-trained crew was more valuable than any ship. Take care of your people and they'll take care of the mission. That's why carriers had those seemingly luxurious amenities. The recreation spaces, the varied food, the barbershops, the movie nights. These weren't wasteful indulgences. They were investments in sustained combat effectiveness. A crew that ate well, slept in relative comfort, had moments of recreation and normalcy. That crew could maintain high performance for months. They didn't burn out as quickly. They didn't suffer from the kind of psychological collapse that affected many German U-boat crews after extended patrols. German officers who experienced this firsthand, who were held as prisoners aboard carriers and saw how American crews lived and worked, often wrote about it with a mixture of admiration and bitterness. Admiration for the effectiveness of the system. Bitterness because they realized their own side had sent them into battle with inferior support and preparation. Now we need to talk about something fundamental, the difference between German and American naval doctrine, and why that difference was so consequential. German naval doctrine in World War II was heavily influenced by the experience of World War I. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 had been the defining moment, a massive clash of battleships where the German High Seas Fleet had tactically held its own against the British Grand Fleet, but strategically had been forced to retreat and never challenged British naval supremacy again. The lessons German admirals drew from Jutland shaped everything that came after. Battleships were still supreme. Surface engagements decided naval supremacy. U-boats were useful for commerce raiding, but they couldn't hold the seas. Naval aviation was auxiliary, useful for reconnaissance and maybe some light strikes, but not a primary arm. This doctrine made sense in European waters. The North Sea, the Baltic, the Mediterranean, these were confined spaces where land-based air power could reach, where surface fleets could maneuver and bring guns to bear, where U-boats could lurk along convoy routes. American naval doctrine evolved differently, shaped by different circumstances. The U.S. Navy had been studying carrier operations seriously since the 1920s. They had experimented, run exercises, developed tactics. By the time World War II began, American naval officers had spent 2 decades figuring out how to use carriers effectively. But here's what really mattered. American doctrine was built around the assumption that the next war would be fought across the Pacific against Japan. And the Pacific demanded different thinking. There are no convenient narrow seas in the Pacific, no friendly ports every few hundred miles, no ability to rely on land-based air cover for most operations. If you wanted to project power across the Pacific, you needed to bring everything with you: air power, logistics, repair capability, everything. Carriers were the answer to that challenge. They were floating airfields that could cross oceans, establish air superiority wherever they arrived, and sustain operations without land bases. American naval doctrine embraced this reality. Carriers became the center of the fleet. Everything else, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, existed to protect and support the carriers. The entire organizational structure, from fleet composition to tactical planning, was built around maximizing carrier effectiveness. German doctrine never made that leap. Even when they recognized carriers as important, they still thought of them as supporting elements in a navy centered on battleships and U-boats. This created a fundamental misalignment. Germany was preparing to fight a naval war based on World War I lessons, refined and improved, but essentially similar. America was preparing to fight a completely different kind of war, one where the aircraft carrier was the decisive weapon. When the two systems collided, not directly, but through observation and intelligence, German officers realized they had been preparing for the wrong conflict. One post-war assessment by a German naval staff officer is particularly revealing. "We understood the technology of aircraft carriers. What we failed to understand was the operational doctrine that made them effective. We saw them as ships with planes. The Americans saw them as mobile air bases that happened to float. That difference in perspective was everything. And it wasn't just about carriers. American doctrine emphasized flexibility, decentralized decision-making, and adaptability. If a plan wasn't working, adjust and improvise. If an opportunity appeared, seize it." German doctrine, by contrast, emphasized thorough planning, strict adherence to orders, and centralized control. This worked well for set-piece operations but struggled with the chaos of carrier warfare, where situations changed minute by minute and opportunities appeared and vanished in hours. The doctrine gap meant that even if Germany had somehow acquired carriers, they might not have used them effectively. Because the problem wasn't just having the ships, it was having the institutional knowledge, the training systems, the operational experience, and the cultural flexibility to employ them properly. So what did this all cost Germany? Not just in ships or battles, but in strategic options and war outcomes. Let's consider a counterfactual. What if Germany had recognized carrier aviation as the future of naval warfare in the 1930s before the war began? What if they had invested heavily in carriers instead of battleships? On the surface, it's tempting to think that might have changed everything. German carriers in the Atlantic, threatening convoys, supporting U-boat operations, perhaps even challenging Allied naval supremacy. But here's the hard truth. Germany probably couldn't have built an effective carrier fleet even if they'd understood the need. Building carriers requires more than shipyards. It requires aircraft industries capable of producing large numbers of carrier-capable planes, extensive pilot training programs, specialized equipment for carrier operations, deep understanding of carrier tactics and doctrine, logistical infrastructure to support extended carrier operations, minus industrial capacity to build and maintain multiple carriers simultaneously. Germany struggled with all of these. Their aircraft industry was already stretched thin supporting the Luftwaffe. Pilot training was never adequate to meet demand. They had no experience with carrier operations. Their logistics were chronically problematic. and their industrial base couldn't have supported both carrier construction and all their other military needs. More importantly, carriers wouldn't have solved Germany's fundamental strategic problem. They were fighting the entire world. Even with a dozen carriers, Germany would have faced British carriers, American carriers, British air power, American air power, and the combined industrial might of the Allies. The arithmetic still wouldn't have worked, but the cost of not understanding carriers was real and significant. In the Atlantic, U-boats that might have operated more freely were instead hunted by carrier-based aircraft. Convoys that should have been vulnerable were instead protected under aerial umbrellas. The happy time for U-boats, that period in 1940 to 1941 when submarines sank Allied shipping almost at will, ended in part because escort carriers closed the air gap. In the Mediterranean, German forces planning defensive operations found themselves constantly outmatched by Allied air power that appeared wherever the carriers chose to position themselves. Invasions that should have been vulnerable proceeded almost unopposed because carriers provided overwhelming support. And perhaps most significantly, the carrier revolution meant that Germany's expensive battleships, ships like Bismarck and Tirpitz that consumed enormous resources, were effectively obsolete before they even entered service. They were powerful, yes, but they were fighting the last war. They could dominate surface engagements that would never happen because carriers had changed the nature of naval combat. The Tirpitz spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that tied down Allied resources through its mere existence but never actually accomplished anything strategic. Bismarck sank the Hood, a glorious victory in traditional terms, but was then hunted down and destroyed, partly by aircraft from the carrier Ark Royal. These expensive ships, which represented huge investments of German steel, labor, and expertise, were ultimately irrelevant to the war's outcome. And they were irrelevant precisely because they were built for a type of warfare that carriers had made obsolete. But beyond the tactical and strategic implications, we need to talk about something more subtle: the psychological impact of carriers on German naval personnel. War is partly a contest of will. Morale matters. The belief that you can win, that your sacrifice serves a purpose, that your efforts might turn the tide, these beliefs sustain soldiers through hardship. American carriers attacked that sense of purpose at a fundamental level. Imagine you're a German U-boat captain. You've trained for years. You're good at what you do. You know your boat and your crew. You've sunk Allied ships. You believe in the mission, strangle Britain's supply lines, force them to surrender, win the war. Then you start encountering carriers. Suddenly your hunting ground is patrolled by aircraft that appear from nowhere. Your periscope observations reveal massive task forces protected by layers of escorts and air cover. You dive to avoid detection, but sonar finds you anyway, and depth charges force you deeper. You manage to line up a shot at a tanker, but before you can fire, aircraft spot your periscope wake and you're forced to abort. Again and again, the carriers deny you the chance to strike. And you hear the reports from other boats. One got caught on the surface and bombed. Another was depth-charged by destroyers guided by carrier aircraft. A third limped home with casualties, having never even gotten close to a convoy. The mission that once seemed possible, winning the Battle of the Atlantic through submarine warfare, starts to feel impossible. Not because your boat failed, not because your crew was inadequate, but because the enemy had developed a counter you couldn't overcome. That sense of futility was corrosive. It sapped morale in ways that combat losses alone couldn't. Because losing a battle you fought with all your skill is bearable. Fighting with all your skill and never even getting the chance to engage the enemy, that's demoralizing on a different level. German surface ship crews faced similar psychological challenges. You're serving aboard a cruiser or destroyer, knowing that somewhere over the horizon might be a carrier group with dozens of aircraft. You can't see them, can't reach them, but they can see you and reach you. The knowledge that you might be attacked at any moment by an enemy you can't fight back against creates constant anxiety. And for German pilots, the carrier threat was personal. Attacking well-defended carrier groups was suicidal. The Americans had figured out fighter direction. Ground controllers vectoring fighters to intercepts based on radar contacts. German pilots often found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting against opponents who seemed to know their every move. The carriers also created a sense of technological inferiority that was psychologically damaging. German military culture prided itself on technical excellence, superior equipment, better training. But when confronted with American carriers, these massive, sophisticated ships that seemed to combine every advantage, German personnel had to confront the reality that the enemy had surpassed them. In post-war interviews, many German naval veterans spoke about carriers with a mixture of respect and resentment. Respect because they were undeniably impressive. Resentment because they represented everything Germany lacked: industrial capacity, technological sophistication, strategic vision. One U-boat veteran put it this way: "We were brave, we were skilled, but what good is bravery against an enemy who can find you from 200 kilometers away and send 20 aircraft to kill you? We were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's weapons." When the war ended and German officers had time to reflect, to write memoirs, to speak in interviews, carriers came up again and again. Karl Donitz, who commanded Germany's U-boat fleet and briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, wrote extensively about the Battle of the Atlantic. He acknowledged that escort carriers had been crucial to the Allied victory, closing the air gap that U-boats had exploited and turning the Atlantic into a killing ground for submarines. Other German admirals and naval officers in their post-war writings returned repeatedly to the same themes. We underestimated carrier warfare. Many admitted that German naval planning had dismissed carriers as vulnerable, specialized vessels rather than recognizing them as revolutionary weapons that would transform naval combat. We couldn't compete industrially. Even if Germany had understood carriers' importance, they lacked the industrial capacity to build them in meaningful numbers while also supporting all their other military needs. We were fighting the wrong war. German doctrine had prepared for surface engagements and submarine warfare in European waters. American doctrine had embraced carrier warfare across oceanic distances. The doctrinal mismatch doomed German naval strategy. The Americans thought differently. This was perhaps the most humbling admission. It wasn't just that Americans had more resources. They had approached the problem of naval warfare from a completely different philosophical direction, and their approach had proven superior. One particularly striking account comes from a German naval officer who was captured in 1943 and spent time aboard an American carrier before being transferred to a POW camp. He wrote, "I had been trained to think of warships as steel fortresses, as fighting machines built around guns and armor. When I saw the carrier, I realized we had been thinking in terms of ships, while the Americans had been thinking in terms of systems. The carrier wasn't just a ship, it was an entire operational concept made manifest in steel. We never grasped that distinction." Another common theme in post-war German accounts was the sense that carrier warfare represented the future, and Germany had been trapped in the past. Naval warfare had evolved, but German strategic thinking hadn't kept pace. This wasn't because German officers were stupid or unimaginative. Some of the most innovative tactical minds of the war were German, but they were constrained by institutional traditions that elevated battleships and surface warfare, resource limitations that forced them to focus on what they could actually build and sustain, strategic circumstances that made European coastal warfare seem more relevant than oceanic carrier operations. Hitler's personal interference, which often prioritized prestige projects over strategic value. The result was that by the time German officers fully understood what American carriers represented, it was far too late to adapt. The industrial and tactical gap was insurmountable. So what does this story really tell us? Beyond the specific details of carriers and tactics, what's the larger lesson here? It's about how wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields, but in factories, in strategic planning rooms, in the choices made years before the first shots are fired. Germany entered World War II with a navy built around doctrines from World War I, refined but fundamentally unchanged. They invested in battleships because battleships had decided the last war. They invested in U-boats because U-boats had nearly won the last war. America looked forward instead of backward. They recognized that technology and doctrine had evolved. They invested in carriers because carriers offered capabilities that traditional ships could never match. And crucially, America had the industrial capacity to turn that strategic vision into reality. It's one thing to understand that carriers are important. It's another thing entirely to build 24 Essex-class carriers in 3 years while also building hundreds of escort carriers, thousands of aircraft, and supporting the largest amphibious operations in history. That industrial capacity wasn't just about factories and resources. It was about organizational efficiency, about mobilizing an entire economy for war production, about training millions of workers, about creating supply chains that stretched across continents and oceans. Germany never had that capacity. Even if German officers had recognized carriers as the future in 1935, Germany couldn't have built a carrier fleet that would have challenged America's. The industrial arithmetic simply didn't work. But the story is also about adaptability. Military organizations are inherently conservative. They train for the last war because that's what they know. Breaking out of that mindset requires institutional courage and strategic vision. The U.S. Navy had that vision. They spent the 1920s and 1930s experimenting with carrier tactics, figuring out what worked, developing doctrine from scratch. By the time war came, they had a 20-year head start on everyone else. Germany never had that opportunity. They were rebuilding their navy from scratch under treaty limitations in the 1930s, and they made choices based on immediate needs and familiar concepts. By the time they recognized carriers as crucial, they were already at war, already committed to a different path. Let's return to where we started. That German officer standing on the deck of an American carrier in 1943, a prisoner trying to process what he's seeing. He spent his career in the Kriegsmarine, trained in proud traditions going back to the Imperial Navy. He knows ships, knows warfare, knows the sea. He's not a fool. He's a professional, competent, skilled. And he's looking at something that shouldn't exist, a ship so large it feels like a city, carrying enough aircraft to constitute an air force, supporting thousands of men with amenities that would seem luxurious even in peacetime, operating with an efficiency and sophistication that seems impossible. Most importantly, he's seeing one of dozens. This isn't Germany's one chance, the irreplaceable asset that must be protected at all costs. This is just another carrier, one of many, replaceable if lost, part of an industrial machine that seems to have no limits. That moment of recognition, that shock, was repeated across the German Naval Officer Corps throughout the war. In intelligence reports, in captured documents, in first-hand encounters, in post-war memoirs. Again and again, German officers confronted the reality that they had been preparing for the wrong war. The carriers were symbols of something larger, America's ability to combine industrial might, technological innovation, strategic vision, and operational flexibility into an overwhelming advantage. They represented a way of war that Germany couldn't counter, couldn't match, couldn't survive. In the end, the carriers didn't just defeat German naval forces. They rendered German naval strategy obsolete. They proved that the age of the battleship was over, that the future belonged to air power at sea, and that America had been building that future while Germany had been clinging to the past. For German officers who witnessed this transformation, it was professionally devastating. Everything they'd trained for, all the doctrine they'd learned, the traditions they'd been taught to respect, all of it had been swept aside by these floating cities of war. The shock wasn't just about the ships themselves. It was about the realization that they'd been beaten before they'd even started, that the war at sea had been decided by choices made in shipyards and planning rooms years before Pearl Harbor, and that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome such fundamental disadvantages. American carriers were more than weapons. They were proof that modern warfare belonged to nations that could mobilize industrial economies, embrace technological change, and project power globally. Germany had tried to fight that kind of war with a navy designed for regional European conflict. And in the vast expanses of the Atlantic and Pacific, as carrier groups roamed freely while German ships huddled in ports or were hunted to extinction, the verdict of history was written in steel and aircraft. The German officers were shocked by America's aircraft carriers because those carriers were everything the Kriegsmarine was not: modern, flexible, overwhelming, and most importantly, representative of a nation whose capacity for war had no visible limits. They were the future, and Germany was the past.